Picture an ordinary guy out working in the fields when out of the blue, he gets called to a mission that's going to flip his life upside down, and not just his, but the whole course of history. That guy? Elisha. A prophet whose life was packed with miracles so mind-blowing that even death couldn't put a lid on God's power working through him. Today, we're diving into the story of Elisha, the prophet who kept the miracles coming even after he was gone. Buckle up, because you're about to see how his faith, guts, and total obedience can light a fire under your own life. Ready for a journey that'll totally flip your idea of what's impossible? All right then, let's get this show on the road. Picture an ordinary guy out working in the fields when out of nowhere he gets called to a mission that's going to flip his life upside down. And not just his, but the whole course of history. That guy, Elisha, a prophet whose life was packed with miracles so mind-blowing that even death couldn't put a lid on God's power working through him. Today, we're diving into the story of Elisha, the prophet who kept the miracles coming even after he was gone. Buckle up, because you're about to see how his faith, guts, and total obedience can light a fire under your own life. Ready for a journey that'll totally flip your idea of what's impossible? All right then, let's get this show on the road. What would you do if God asked you to leave everything behind, your job, your family, your comfort, to follow a mission you don't even fully understand? That was the reality for Elisha, an ordinary guy, a farmer whose life was turned upside down by a single encounter with God. His story doesn't start in a palace or a temple, but in a field where he was plowing the land with 12 yoke of oxen. It was just another day until Elijah, the great prophet, showed up and threw his cloak over him. That simple yet deeply symbolic gesture marked the beginning of a journey that would change not only Elisha's life, but the course of Israel's history. But who was Elisha before that defining moment? The Bible tells us he was the son of Shaphat, an ordinary man, probably from a family of farmers. He wasn't from a priestly or royal lineage. He was a man of the people, someone who understood the value of hard work and simplicity. And maybe that's exactly why God chose him. In a world where power and influence often led to corruption, Elisha represented something different: humility, availability, and a heart willing to obey. When Elijah threw his cloak over Elisha, he wasn't just handing off a task, he was transferring a mission. The cloak was a symbol of prophetic authority and identity, and Elisha immediately understood the weight of that gesture. He didn't hesitate. The Bible says he left the oxen, ran after Elijah and said, "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, and then I'll come with you." 1 Kings 19:20. That response reveals something deep about Elisha's character. He wasn't impulsive or reckless. He wanted to say goodbye to his family, but he was all in when it came to following God's call. Elijah's response was cryptic. "Go back, for what have I done to you?" Those words might sound harsh, but they carry a profound meaning. Elijah was testing Elisha, challenging him to count the cost of following God. And Elisha passed the test. He not only said goodbye to his family, but he did something radical. He killed the oxen, broke up the plow, and used the wood to cook the meat, which he gave to the people to eat. That act symbolized a complete break from his old life. He left, no room for turning back. He was all in on the mission God had given him. But why did God choose Elisha? What was it about him that made him the ideal candidate to succeed Elijah? The answer might lie in his willingness to leave it all behind. While many of us struggle to balance our personal ambitions with God's call, Elisha shows us what it means to put God first, not just in words, but in action. He didn't cling to comfort or security. He embraced the unknown, trusting that God would guide him, and that trust was tested almost immediately. Right after being called, Elisha witnessed one of the most dramatic moments in the Bible, Elijah's ascension to heaven in a whirlwind. As the two walked together, Elijah asked Elisha, "What can I do for you before I'm taken from you?" And Elisha responded with one of the boldest statements in Scripture, "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." 2 Kings 2:9. He wasn't asking for wealth, fame, or power. He was asking for more of God. He wanted to be equipped to fulfill the mission God had given him, not by his own strength, but by the power of the Spirit. Elijah replied that it was a difficult request, but if Elisha saw him being taken away, it would be a sign that God had granted it. And that's exactly what happened. Elisha saw Elijah being taken up and picked up the cloak that had fallen. With that cloak, he struck the waters of the Jordan, and they parted, just as they had for Elijah. That was the moment Elisha fully stepped into his role as a prophet. He wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was now a vessel for God, ready to perform miracles that would impact generations. But what can we learn from Elisha's calling? First, we see that God doesn't choose people based on their credentials or status. He chooses those who are willing to obey no matter their circumstances. Second, Elisha's story challenges us to count the cost of following God. Are we willing to leave our oxen and plows, our securities and plans, to follow God's call? And finally, Elisha shows us that true power doesn't come from us, but from God. When we surrender to Him, He empowers us to do the impossible. Elisha's life began with an act of faith, an act that changed everything. And that's the beauty of God's call. He invites us to leave behind the ordinary and embrace the extraordinary. But the choice is ours. Will we, like Elisha, run after God no matter the cost? Or will we cling to what's safe and familiar? Elisha's story challenges us to choose the path of faith, even when it seems uncertain, because in the end, it's on that path that we find true purpose and the power of God. Picture a man so filled with God's Spirit that even water obeys his voice. The sick are healed, and the impossible becomes possible. That man was Elisha, the prophet whose ministry was marked by miracles that didn't just defy the laws of nature, but also revealed the compassionate and powerful heart of God. Today, we're diving into some of Elisha's most jaw-dropping miracles and uncovering what they teach us about faith, obedience, and the power of God. The first miracle we're looking at is the healing of Jericho's water. When Elisha rolled into town, the locals told him the water was bad and the land was barren. Elisha asked for a new jar with salt, tossed the salt into the water source, and declared, "This is what the Lord says, I have healed this water. Never again will it cause death or make the land unproductive." 2 Kings 2:21. And just like that, it happened. This miracle might seem simple, but it's packed with meaning. The salt symbolized purification and preservation, and the new jar represented a fresh start. Through this act, Elisha showed that God can turn what's bitter and barren into something that brings life and healing. How often do we feel stuck in situations that seem hopeless? The story of Jericho reminds us that God can transform any circumstance, no matter how tough it looks. Another mind-blowing miracle was the multiplication of the widow's oil. A woman came to Elisha in desperation because her late husband had left debts, and the creditors were about to take her 2 sons as slaves. Elisha asked what she had at home, and she replied, "Your servant has nothing there at all, except a small jar of olive oil." 2 Kings 4:2. Elisha then told her to borrow jars from all her neighbors, shut the door, and start pouring the oil into the jars. The oil didn't stop flowing until every jar was full. This miracle didn't just save her family from slavery, it also showed God's generosity. The widow had only a tiny jar of oil, but God multiplied what she had according to her faith and obedience. How often do we underestimate the little we have? God can do a lot with the little we give Him. One of Elisha's most dramatic miracles was the resurrection of the Shunammite woman's son. A wealthy and generous woman had built a room for Elisha in her home, recognizing he was a man of God. As a reward, Elisha promised she'd have a son, even though she was old, and her husband was too. The son was born, but a few years later he suddenly died. The Shunammite woman went to Elisha and, in an incredible act of faith, said, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." 2 Kings 4:30. Elisha went back with her, and after fervent prayer, the boy was brought back to life. This miracle didn't just show God's power over death, it also highlighted the importance of persistent faith. The Shunammite woman didn't give up, even in the face of tragedy. She clung to God's promise and was rewarded with a miracle. Another fascinating miracle was the healing of Naaman, the commander of the Syrian army. Naaman suffered from leprosy, a disease that not only caused physical pain, but also isolated him socially. He went to Elisha for healing, but was offended when the prophet simply told him to wash 7 times in the Jordan River. Naaman expected a dramatic gesture, but God chose to act in a simple way. After being convinced by his servants, Naaman obeyed and was healed. This miracle teaches us a powerful lesson about humility and obedience. Often we expect God to act in grand ways, but he frequently works through simple acts of faith. Naaman's healing also showed that God's power isn't limited to Israel. He cares about all nations. One of Elisha's more curious miracles involved an axe head that fell into the Jordan River. One of the prophet's disciples was cutting wood when the iron axe head fell into the water. He was desperate because the axe was borrowed. Elisha asked where it had fallen, cut off a stick, and threw it into the water. The iron axe head floated to the surface, and the young man picked it up. This miracle might seem minor compared to others, but it reveals something important about God's character. He cares about even the smallest details of our lives. Nothing is insignificant to him. Finally, let's talk about the miracle of the multiplied bread. During a famine, Elisha was given 20 loaves of barley bread and some heads of grain. He instructed that the food be given to 100 men, and everyone ate with leftovers to spare. This miracle foreshadowed what Jesus would do centuries later, showing that God's power isn't limited by time or circumstances. He can meet our needs in ways that go beyond human logic. But what do all these miracles have in common? They show that God's power isn't limited by circumstances, logic, or human expectations. Elisha was just an instrument. The real power came from God. And that leads us to a crucial question. Are we willing to be God's instruments, even when the odds seem impossible? Elisha challenges us to trust in God's power and obey, even when we don't fully understand his plan. Every miracle of Elisha points to a greater truth. God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. If he could use Elisha to perform miracles, he can use you and me to do the impossible. The question is, are we willing to trust him and obey, no matter the cost? Elisha's story reminds us that when we surrender to God, he can do immeasurably more than we could ever ask or imagine. What makes a leader truly great? Is it the power they wield, the miracles they perform, or the influence they leave for future generations? In Elisha's case, the answer is clear. His real legacy wasn't just in the miracles he pulled off, but in the lives he touched and the example of faith he left for those who came after him. Today, we're diving into the lasting impact of Elisha as a prophet, mentor, and spiritual leader, and discovering how his legacy can inspire our own faith journey. Elisha wasn't just a miracle worker, he was a teacher, a mentor, and a guide for those seeking to follow God. One of the most striking aspects of his ministry was his dedication to discipleship. Elisha didn't work alone. He built a community of prophets, known as the sons of the prophets, who learned from him and carried on his work. These men weren't just students, They were partners in the mission of bringing God's word to the people of Israel. Elisha invested time and energy into training them, preparing them to continue the work he had started. This shows us the importance of not just doing great things, but also investing in the next generation. A powerful example of Elisha's role as a mentor is found in the story of Gehazi, his servant. Gehazi wasn't just an assistant. He was a disciple learning directly from Elisha. However, his story also serves as a warning about the dangers of greed and disobedience. When Naaman was healed of his leprosy, he offered gifts to Elisha, who refused them. But Gehazi, driven by greed, chased after Naaman and lied to get the gifts. As a result, he was struck with Naaman's leprosy. This story reminds us that a leader's legacy isn't just about the good they do, but also about the mistakes they help others avoid. Elisha, as a mentor, had to deal with his disciples' failures, but he never stopped teaching and correcting with love. Another key part of Elisha's legacy was his ability to lead in times of crisis. During his ministry, Israel faced wars, famine, and corruption. In the midst of these challenges, Elisha stood firm as a voice of hope and guidance. He didn't just perform miracles to relieve the people's suffering, he also offered wise counsel to the kings and leaders of Israel. For example, when the king of Israel was at war with the Syrians, Elisha repeatedly revealed the enemy's plans, showing that God was in control, even in the chaos. That kind of leadership, steady, courageous, and God-centered, is a powerful example for us today. But Elisha's legacy didn't end with his lifetime. One of the most jaw-dropping moments of his ministry happened after his death. As we saw earlier, a man was brought back to life when he touched Elisha's bones. This post-death miracle didn't just show the ongoing power of God, it also symbolized Elisha's lasting impact. Even after he was gone, he continued to inspire and bring life to those who sought God. This reminds us that our legacy doesn't end when we're gone. It keeps influencing future generations. Elisha also left us an example of humility and service. Despite his power and influence, he never sought glory for himself. He lived a simple life without luxury or showiness. His priority was serving God and the people, not accumulating wealth or power. This humility is especially clear in his relationship with Elijah. When Elijah was taken up to heaven, Elisha didn't try to replace him or outshine him. Instead, he honored Elijah's legacy while building his own. That attitude of humility and respect is something we can all learn from and apply in our own lives. Another important part of Elisha's legacy was his ability to see beyond the immediate circumstances. He didn't just deal with the problems of the present, he also looked to the future. For example, he anointed Jehu as king of Israel, even though he knew it would bring drastic and even violent changes. Elisha understood that sometimes God's work involves sacrifice and difficult transitions. That long-term vision is something we often lack in our own faith journeys. We get so caught up in our immediate problems that we forget God is working on a bigger plan. But perhaps the most important part of Elisha's legacy was his faithfulness to God. In a world where many turned to idolatry and corruption, Elisha stayed firm in his faith. He didn't just perform miracles, he lived a life of integrity and devotion. This faithfulness not only made him a powerful instrument in God's hands, but also set an example for everyone who followed him. Elisha shows us that true success isn't measured by human achievements, but by our obedience and faithfulness to God. So what can we learn from Elisha's legacy? First, we see the importance of investing in the next generation. Elisha didn't just do great things, he prepared others to continue God's work. Second, he teaches us to lead with humility and integrity, putting God first in everything we do. And finally, he reminds us that our legacy doesn't end when we're gone. It keeps influencing future generations. Elisha challenges us to live a life that doesn't just accomplish big things, but leaves a lasting impact. He shows us that true success isn't about how many miracles we perform, but about how many lives we touch and how faithfully we serve God. So, what will your legacy be? How are you investing in the next generation? And how are you living a life of faithfulness to God? Elisha's story inspires us to seek not just great achievements, but a legacy that glorifies God and blesses those who come after us. What happens when a man of God dies? Does his power and influence just fade away with him? The story of Elisha gives us a surprising answer. Even after his death, God's power kept working through him. Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating miracles in the Bible, the resurrection of a man who touched Elisha's bones. This event doesn't just challenge our understanding of life and death, it also teaches us deep lessons about the legacy of faith and the power of God. The story kicks off after Elisha's death. He had served God faithfully for decades, performing miracles that impacted countless lives. Now he was buried, and the people of Israel went on with their lives, maybe thinking the era of big miracles was over. But God had other plans. In Second Kings 13:20-21, we read that during a Moabite raid, a group of Israelites was burying a man when they saw a band of raiders coming their way. In a panic, they threw the man's body into Elisha's tomb and took off. But then something incredible happened. As soon as the body touched Elisha's bones, the man came back to life and stood up. This miracle is one of a kind in the Bible. There's no other account of someone being resurrected just by touching the remains of a prophet. But what does it mean? Why did God choose to perform this miracle in this way? To get it, we need to look at the context and the symbolism behind this event. First off, this miracle shows that God's power isn't limited by death. Elisha had died, but the Spirit of God that lived in him was still alive and active. This reminds us that for God, death isn't the end. He's the Lord of life, and his power goes beyond even the limits of mortality. This miracle also points to the resurrection of Jesus, who conquered death once and for all. Just like the man was brought back to life by touching Elisha's bones, we receive eternal life through Jesus, who is the resurrection and the life. John 11:25. Second, this miracle reinforces Elisha's legacy. During his life, he was a powerful instrument in God's hands, performing miracles that brought hope and healing to the people of Israel. Now, even after his death, he continued to be a channel of God's power. This teaches us that the impact of a life devoted to God doesn't end when we're gone. Our actions, our faith, and our example keep influencing future generations. Elisha shows us that true legacy isn't measured by wealth or fame, but by the power of God working through us. Third, this miracle challenges us to rethink our understanding of holiness and God's power. In the Old Testament, objects and places associated with God's presence were considered sacred. The Ark of the Covenant, for example, was so holy that touching it the wrong way resulted in death. 2 Samuel 6:6-7. In the same way, Elisha's bones, which had been inhabited by God's Spirit, still carried a remnant of that power. This doesn't mean the bones themselves had magical power, but that God chose to use them as an instrument to perform his miracle. This reminds us that God can use anything, even something seemingly insignificant, to accomplish his purposes. But what does this miracle mean for us today? How can we apply this story to our modern lives? First, it reminds us that God's power isn't limited by our circumstances. Just like he used Elisha's bones to bring life, he can use our lives, even when we feel weak or incapable, to do great things. Second, this story challenges us to live a life that leaves a legacy of faith. Elisha didn't just perform miracles. During his life, he kept impacting the world after his death. What kind of legacy are we building? Are we living in a way that glorifies God and blesses others? Finally, This miracle gives us hope. In a world where death seems like the end of everything, Elisha's story reminds us that God has the power to bring life where there's death, hope where there's despair, and light where there's darkness. Whether in our personal lives, our communities, or our world, we can trust that God is in control and that He can perform miracles that go beyond our understanding. So what can we learn from Elisha's post-death miracle? First, we see that God's power isn't limited by death. He's the Lord of life, and His power transcends even the limits of mortality. Second, we're reminded of the importance of living a life that leaves a legacy of faith. Elisha didn't just do great things during his life. He kept impacting the world after his death. And finally, this story gives us hope that no matter how dark things may seem, God can bring life and renewal. Elisha challenges us to trust in God's power, even when circumstances seem impossible. He shows us that when we live a life of faith and obedience, our impact can last long after we're gone. So, what will your legacy be? How are you living a life that glorifies God and blesses others? Elisha's story inspires us to seek not just big achievements, but a legacy that keeps bringing life and hope even after we're gone. Elisha lived thousands of years ago, but his story still rings out with striking relevance for today. In a world full of uncertainty, challenges, and unanswered questions, Elisha's life offers us powerful lessons about faith, courage, and obedience. Today, we're exploring how we can apply Elisha's stories and miracles to our modern lives, turning his journey into a practical guide for facing our own challenges. The first lesson we learn from Elisha is the importance of answering God's call with courage and willingness. When Elijah threw his cloak over Elisha, he didn't hesitate. He left behind his life as a farmer, burned his bridges, and followed God's call without looking back. In our own lives, how often are we faced with opportunities to follow God, but hesitate because of fear, insecurity, or comfort? Elisha challenges us to drop our excuses and trust that when God calls us, He also equips us. Whether it's in our career, relationships, or ministry, are we willing to say yes to God, even when the path seems uncertain? Another crucial lesson is the importance of faith in the impossible. Elisha performed miracles that defied the laws of nature. He healed bitter waters, multiplied oil, raised the dead, and even made an axe head float. These miracles weren't just displays of power. They were reminders that for God, nothing is impossible. In our lives, how often do we face situations that seem hopeless? Elisha teaches us to look beyond our circumstances and trust that God can do the impossible. Whether it's a financial crisis, a broken relationship, or a health challenge, we can trust that God is in control and that He can act in ways that go beyond our understanding. Elisha also shows us the importance of humility and service. Despite his power and influence, he never sought glory for himself. He lived a simple life, dedicated to serving God and the people. In a world where many chase fame, wealth, and recognition, Elisha reminds us that true success is found in serving others and glorifying God. How can we apply this lesson in our lives? We can look for opportunities to serve in our community, church, or family, putting the needs of others above our own. Elisha challenges us to live a life of humility and generosity, knowing that real impact doesn't come from big titles, but from small acts of love. Another powerful lesson is the importance of investing in the next generation. Elisha didn't just perform miracles. He also trained and discipled the sons of the prophets, preparing them to carry on God's work. In our lives, how are we investing in future generations? Whether as parents, mentors, or leaders, we have a responsibility to share our faith and wisdom with those who come after us. Elisha shows us that true legacy isn't about how many miracles we perform, but about how many lives we touch and how well we prepare others to follow God. Elisha also teaches us the importance of persistence in faith. When the Shunammite woman came to him desperate over her son's death, Elisha didn't give up. He prayed, acted, and persisted until the miracle happened. In our lives, how often do we give up when things get tough? Elisha challenges us to keep going, even when the odds seem impossible. He reminds us that faith isn't just about believing in God, but also about trusting Him, even when we don't see an immediate solution. Another key lesson is the importance of obeying God, even when His instructions seem strange or illogical. When Naaman was healed of his leprosy, he expected a dramatic gesture, but Elisha simply told him to wash in the Jordan River. Naaman almost walked away, but when he obeyed, he experienced God's power. In our lives, how often do we resist God's instructions because they don't make sense to us? Elisha teaches us that obedience, even when it seems illogical, is the path to experiencing God's power. Elisha also shows us the importance of looking beyond our immediate circumstances. When he anointed Jehu as king of Israel, he knew it would bring drastic and even violent changes. But he understood that God was working on a bigger plan. In our lives, how can we learn to look beyond our immediate circumstances and trust that God is in control? Elisha challenges us to have a long-term vision, knowing that God is working on a plan that goes beyond our understanding. Finally, Elisha reminds us of the importance of leaving a legacy of faith. Even after his death, he continued to impact the world through the miracle of resurrection. This shows us that the true impact of our lives isn't measured by earthly achievements, but by our faithfulness to God and our impact on the lives of others. How are we living our lives? Are we building a legacy that glorifies God and blesses future generations? So what can we learn from Elisha today? First, we see the importance of answering God's call with courage and willingness. Second, we're reminded of the importance of faith in the impossible and humility in service. Third, Elisha challenges us to invest in the next generation and to persevere in faith, even when things get tough. And finally, he shows us the importance of obeying God, looking beyond our circumstances and leaving a legacy of faith. Elisha inspires us to live a life of faith and courage, trusting that when we follow God, He can do immeasurably more than we could ever ask or imagine. So what's your next step? How can you apply Elisha's lessons to your life today? Elisha's story challenges us to seek not just big achievements, but a life that glorifies God and impacts the world around us. Elisha's life wasn't just a series of jaw-dropping miracles. It was a powerful testament to what happens when someone decides to trust God completely. From the moment he left his plow to follow Elijah, to the post-death miracle that shook the world, Elisha showed us that God's power isn't limited by our circumstances, our doubts, or even our mortality. He challenges us to live a life of radical faith, unwavering obedience, and an eternal legacy. But the big question is, how can we live like Elisha today? How can we embrace God's call in our lives, trust Him in the impossible moments, and leave a legacy that keeps impacting the world even after we're gone? The answer lies in every small step of faith we take, in every yes we say to God, even when the path seems uncertain. And if you're wondering where to start, here's a challenge. Today, ask God to show you where He wants you to step up. It could be in your family, at your job, in your community, or even in a calling you've been putting off out of fear. Remember, Elisha wasn't a superhero. He was an ordinary guy, just like you and me. But he chose to trust an extraordinary God. And you can too. If this video touched your heart and inspired your faith, don't forget to share it with someone who needs this message. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button and join us. We've got so many more amazing Bible stories to explore together, packed with lessons that can transform your life. Also, drop a comment below. What's the most powerful lesson you've learned from Elisha's story? We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, remember, the same God who used Elisha to perform miracles wants to use you to do the impossible. So go ahead, live with faith and courage, and leave a legacy that glorifies God. See you soon.